The last tear slid down Bethany Jones's cheek as the stagecoach rattled over another rut in the dusty road, forcing her to grip the leather strap hanging from the ceiling to steady herself. Texas in 1875 was as unforgiving as the faces of the other passengers staring at her with unveiled disdain. "Good heavens, girl, compose yourself," snapped Mrs. Greenfield, an older woman with gray hair pulled so tightly into a bun that it seemed to stretch her skin. "A lady does not make such a spectacle in public." "Indeed," agreed the banker sitting across from Bethany. "Tears will not bring your father back, nor settle his debts. Weakness is a luxury no one can afford out here." Bethany dabbed at her face with a handkerchief that had once belonged to her mother. Just 3 days ago, she'd buried her father, the last of her family, only to discover that his gambling debts had cost her their home in Boston. Now, at 22, she was headed to the small town of Redemption Creek to stay with her father's cousin, a woman she'd never met who had reluctantly agreed to take her in. "I apologize," Bethany whispered, though she wasn't truly sorry. Her tears were private, the only thing she had left that truly belonged to her. "You Eastern girls," said a woman in a fine traveling dress, shaking her head, "always weeping at the slightest inconvenience. You'll never survive here with such fragility." Bethany turned her face toward the window, watching as the rolling landscape passed by. The vastness of Texas overwhelmed her endless sky, stretching over plains that seemed to run forever. So different from the crowded streets of Boston where she'd spent her entire life. The stagecoach lurched again, and the driver called out that they were approaching Redemption Creek. Bethany's stomach tightened. What awaited her in this dusty frontier town? What kind of life could she build from nothing? As the stagecoach pulled into the main street, Bethany saw a town that seemed to have sprouted from the earth itself, wooden buildings lining a wide dirt road, horses tied to hitching posts, and people moving with purpose despite the afternoon heat. Her new home, whether she was ready for it or not. When the coach stopped, the other passengers disembarked quickly, leaving Bethany to gather her single trunk with all her remaining possessions. The driver tossed it down from the roof with little ceremony, and it landed with a thud in the dust. "Miss Jones," a thin woman with a pinched face approached. "I'm Martha Wilson, your father's cousin's neighbor. I'm afraid Clara's taken ill and sent me to fetch you." Bethany's heart sank. "Is she very sick?" "Sick enough that you'll be staying at the boarding house instead," Martha said flatly. "Clara can't manage a guest right now. Come along, I'll show you the way." So much for family. Bethany struggled with her trunk, fighting back fresh tears that threatened to spill. Martha noticed and clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "You'll need to toughen up, girl. Tears don't put food on the table or a roof over your head. They're just a waste of water in a place where water's precious." By the time they reached the boarding house, a crowd had gathered outside the saloon across the street. Loud voices carried on the dry air as men argued about something Bethany couldn't make out. "What's happening over there?" she asked. Martha sniffed. "Just trouble. That new cattle baron, Sinclair, pushing around the smaller ranchers again. Nothing that concerns proper ladies." The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. Inside, Martha introduced Bethany to Mrs. Cooper, a stern-faced woman who ran the establishment with strict rules. "Room and board is $2 a week, payable in advance," Mrs. Cooper stated. "No gentlemen callers, no alcohol, and no returning after 9 in the evening." Bethany opened her reticule and counted out the money with trembling fingers. The small collection of coins and bills represented nearly half of what she had left in the world. "And you'll need to find employment," Mrs. Cooper added. "I don't take charity cases." "I understand," Bethany said softly. "I was trained as a teacher in Boston." Mrs. Cooper laughed, a harsh sound with no humor. "We've got no school that could pay you proper. But the general store might need help, or perhaps the dressmaker." After being shown to a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and little else, Bethany finally allowed herself to sit on the edge of the mattress. The events of the past week crashed over her like a wave, and she buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had no idea how long she'd been crying when a knock at the door startled her. Hastily wiping her eyes, she called, "Yes?" Mrs. Cooper stood in the doorway, frowning. "Supper's on the table. And do compose yourself. The other boarders don't need to see such displays." Bethany nodded, splashing water on her face from the basin and pinching her cheeks to bring color back. She followed Mrs. Cooper downstairs to the dining room where 5 other boarders were already seated, 2 older men who appeared to be shopkeepers, a young woman who worked at the general store, and a married couple who ran the town's small newspaper. "This is Miss Jones from Boston," Mrs. Cooper introduced her curtly. "She'll be staying with us for the foreseeable future." The meal was simple beef stew and cornbread, but Bethany found it difficult to eat. Every time she looked up, she felt the others staring at her, judging her fine clothes that now seemed ridiculously out of place, noting her red-rimmed eyes. "What brings you to Redemption Creek, Miss Jones?" asked the newspaper wife, Mrs. Halloran. Before Bethany could answer, Martha Wilson, who apparently also boarded there, chimed in. "Her father died in debt. She's got nowhere else to go." The table fell silent. Bethany felt heat rise to her face. "I'm sorry for your loss," Mrs. Halloran said finally. "Thank you," Bethany whispered, focusing on her plate. "Well," said one of the shopkeepers, "at least you've got family here. Clara's a good woman, even if she's got that cough." "She's not staying with Clara," Martha volunteered. "The poor woman's too sick to take her in." More stares. More judgment. Bethany felt naked under their scrutiny. "I plan to find work immediately," she said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "Doing what, exactly?" asked the other shopkeeper. "No offense, miss, but we don't have much need for fancy Boston ladies out here." A tear escaped despite Bethany's best efforts, sliding down her cheek and dropping onto her plate. She wiped it away quickly, but not before the table noticed. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Martha muttered. "There she goes again. Been crying since she stepped off the stagecoach." "Tears won't feed you," Mrs. Cooper said sharply. "They won't clothe you or put a roof over your head." "I know," Bethany said, her voice barely audible. The young woman from the general store rolled her eyes. "Eastern girls, so soft. My pa says they break like china the first time the wind blows." Bethany excused herself before finishing her meal, retreating to her room. From her window, she could see the saloon still bustling with activity as night fell over Redemption Creek. The sound of piano music drifted across the street, along with bursts of laughter and occasional shouts. Sleep eluded her as she lay on the hard mattress, wondering how her life had changed so drastically. Just weeks ago, she'd been teaching at a girls' school in Boston, living in the comfortable home her father had provided. Now she was here, alone, with no prospects and few skills that seemed valuable in this rough world. Morning came too soon, the sun streaming through the thin curtains. Bethany dressed in her plainest skirt and blouse, hoping to appear more practical. After a breakfast where she endured more sidelong glances and whispered comments, she set out to find employment. The general store was her first stop. The owner, Mr. Peterson, listened to her request with obvious skepticism. "Can you keep accounts? Handle money?" he asked. "Yes, of course," Bethany assured him. "Ever dealt with cowboys coming in from a cattle drive? Men who haven't seen civilization in months?" "Well, no. But sorry, Miss Jones. I need someone sturdier. Someone who won't burst into tears when a customer gets rowdy." Word had clearly spread about the weeping Boston girl. Bethany felt her face flush with shame as she left the store. The dressmaker was kinder, but equally unhelpful. "I simply don't have enough business to take on help," she explained apologetically. "Most women here make their own clothes or order from catalogs." By midday, Bethany had been turned away from every respectable business in town. Exhausted and disheartened, she sat on a bench outside the general store, trying desperately not to cry again. "Excuse me, miss? Are you all right?" Bethany looked up to see a young woman about her age, dressed in a simple but clean dress, her brown hair tucked under a practical bonnet. "I'm fine, thank you," Bethany said automatically. The woman smiled kindly. "You're the new girl from Boston, aren't you?" "I'm Emma Taylor. I work at the Willow Tree Cafe just down the street." "Bethany Jones," she replied, offering her hand. "It's nice to meet you. You look like you could use a friend and maybe a cup of coffee," Emma said. "Come on, I'm due back for the lunch rush anyway." Too tired to refuse, Bethany followed Emma to a small cafe with cheerful yellow curtains in the windows. Inside, a few tables were occupied by townspeople having their midday meal. "Mrs. Blake, this is Bethany Jones," Emma introduced her to a plump woman wiping her hands on an apron. She's new in town. Mrs. Blake gave Bethany an appraising look. The Boston girl, staying at Cooper's place? Heard about you. Bethany's heart sank. Yes, madam. To her surprise, Mrs. Blake smiled. Well, don't look so frightened, child. Not everyone in this town is as starched as Martha Wilson and that crowd. Emma poured Bethany a cup of coffee and set a plate with a slice of apple pie in front of her. On the house, she whispered. Mrs. Blake's pie can fix almost anything. The kindness was so unexpected that Bethany felt tears welling up again. She blinked rapidly, determined not to prove everyone right about her weakness. Now then, Mrs. Blake said, sitting down across from her. Emma says you're looking for work. Yes, though it seems no one in town is hiring, Bethany replied. That's because you're asking the wrong people, Mrs. Blake said. I could use another pair of hands here. Nothing fancy, mind you. Serving, cleaning, maybe some cooking if you've got any skill with it. Hope fluttered in Bethany's chest. I can learn quickly. Pays not much room and board plus $2 a week. But there's a small room upstairs you could have instead of staying at that dreary boarding house. I'd be very grateful for the opportunity, Bethany said sincerely. Good. You can start tomorrow. Emma will show you the ropes. Mrs. Blake stood. And Bethany? Don't let this town harden you too quickly. A tender heart isn't always a weakness. That evening, Bethany returned to the boarding house with lighter steps. As she approached, she noticed a commotion in the street. A group of men had gathered, voices raised in anger. At the center stood a tall man with his back to her, facing down three rough-looking cowboys. You can't just claim water rights to the entire creek, Sinclair, one of the cowboys shouted. Small ranchers need that water too. I've got the papers legal and proper, the tall man replied, his voice deep and steady. But I've told you all, you can water your cattle at the North Bend. I'm not cutting anyone off. That's what you say now, another cowboy snarled. But we all know how your type operates. First the water, then the land. The tension in the air was palpable. Bethany froze, unsure whether to proceed or turn back. Before she could decide, one of the cowboys spotted her. Well, look here. The crying Boston lady's come to watch the show. He laughed cruelly. Maybe she'll water the street with her tears, and we won't need the creek after all. The other men turned to look at her, and Bethany felt her face burn with humiliation. The tall man turned as well, and she caught her first glimpse of his face strong-jawed, with intense blue eyes under the brim of a black Stetson. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind. That's enough, Tucker, he said sharply. The lady has nothing to do with our business. Bethany tried to walk past quickly, head down, but her foot caught on an uneven board in the walkway. She stumbled, and as she caught herself, the reticule slipped from her arm, spilling its contents into the dust, including, to her mortification, her handkerchief still damp with tears. The cowboys laughed as she knelt to gather her belongings. Careful there, miss. Don't start the waterworks again, or we'll all drown. Please, Bethany whispered, fingers trembling as she scrambled to collect her few precious items. Leave her be, the tall man said, stepping forward. But the cowboys were enjoying themselves too much. Ah, she's about to cry again. Look at her. What good is a woman who dissolves at the first harsh word? No wonder she couldn't make it in Boston. A tear slipped down Bethany's cheek, and she cursed her own weakness. Why couldn't she control herself? Why did she have to prove them right? More tears followed, sparkling in the late afternoon sun as they fell to the dust. She couldn't stop them, couldn't breathe through the humiliation. I said that's enough. The tall man's voice cut through the laughter like a whip. He stepped between Bethany and the cowboys, then turned and knelt beside her, picking up her handkerchief and pressing it gently into her hand. Don't listen to them, miss, he said quietly, just for her ears. Those tears shine like diamonds in this light. Nothing to be ashamed of. Stunned by his kindness, Bethany looked up into eyes as blue as the Texas sky. He helped her to her feet with a gentle hand under her elbow. I'm Ryker Sinclair, he said, and despite what these men would have you believe, I'm not the villain of Redemption Creek. Bethany Jones, she replied softly. Ryker turned back to the cowboys, his posture straight and commanding. Our business is concluded for today, gentlemen. I suggest you head back to your ranches before this gets any more unpleasant. Something in his tone, perhaps the quiet confidence or the underlying steel, made the men back down. They dispersed with muttered curses and backward glances. "May I escort you somewhere, Miss Jones?" Ryker asked when they were gone. "Just to the boarding house," she said, nodding toward the building. "Thank you for your intervention." They walked in silence for a few steps before Ryker spoke again. "Don't let them get to you. This town can be hard on newcomers, especially those they perceive as different." "They seem to have decided I'm too weak for the West," Bethany said with a small, sad smile. "Tears aren't weakness," Ryker replied seriously. "They're just water and salt. It's what causes them that matters. Grief is honest. Fear is rational in dangerous times. There's no shame in either." They reached the boarding house steps, and Bethany turned to face him. "You're very kind, Mr. Sinclair. Though from what I heard, not everyone in town shares that opinion of you." A wry smile crossed his face. "I came to Texas with dreams bigger than most folks here are comfortable with. That makes me a threat to some." "Dreams of water rights?" Bethany asked, remembering the argument. "Dreams of building something lasting," he corrected. "The water rights are just part of it. I have plans for a ranch that could change how cattle are raised in this part of Texas. Sustainable methods, better breeding. But change frightens people." The door to the boarding house opened, and Mrs. Cooper stood framed in it, her expression disapproving. "Miss Jones," she said coldly, "I wasn't aware you were acquainted with Mr. Sinclair." "We just met, madam," Bethany replied. "Mr. Sinclair kindly helped me when I dropped my belongings." Mrs. Cooper's lips thinned. "Well, supper's nearly on the table. And Mr. Sinclair, I'm sure you have business elsewhere." Ryker tipped his hat politely. "Indeed, Mrs. Cooper. Good evening, Miss Jones. Perhaps we'll meet again under more pleasant circumstances." As he walked away, Mrs. Cooper seized Bethany's arm and pulled her inside. "That man is trouble, Miss Jones. He's buying up land and water rights all over the county, pushing out folks who've been here for generations." "He seemed perfectly gentlemanly to me," Bethany said. "That's how men like him operate," Mrs. Cooper warned. "Smooth words and fine manners hiding ruthless ambition. You'd do well to stay clear of him." At supper, Bethany announced her new position at the Willow Tree Cafe and her intention to move into the room above it. The news was met with raised eyebrows and exchanged glances. "A cafe?" Martha Wilson said with obvious distaste. "Serving cowboys and drifters? Hardly respectable work for a lady." "Mrs. Blake runs a perfectly decent establishment," Bethany defended, finding courage in her newfound independence. "And I'm fortunate she's offered me both work and lodging." "Well," Mrs. Cooper sniffed, "I suppose beggars can't be choosers." "I'm not begging," Bethany said quietly but firmly. "I'm working. There's dignity in that, isn't there?" The table fell silent, and Bethany felt a small surge of triumph. Perhaps she wasn't as weak as they all thought. The next morning, Bethany moved her trunk to the small but clean room above the cafe. Emma helped her settle in, chatting cheerfully as they made up the bed with fresh linens. "Mrs. Blake is the best person in this town," Emma confided. "She took me in when my pa died 2 years ago. Wouldn't hear of me going to live with my uncle who drinks too much and has wandering hands." "She seems very kind," Bethany agreed. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." "Word is you met Ryker Sinclair yesterday," Emma said with a knowing smile. "Half the single ladies in the county are sweet on him, you know." Bethany felt her cheeks warm. It was a brief encounter. He intervened when some cowboys were being unkind. "That sounds like him," Emma nodded. "For all the talk about him being ruthless in business, he's always been a gentleman. Helped pay for the new schoolhouse roof last winter, though he didn't want anyone to know it was his money. Mrs. Cooper seems to think he's trying to take over the whole county." Emma shrugged. "He's ambitious, sure enough. But Pa always said you can judge a man by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. By that measure, Ryker Sinclair's a good man." Working at the cafe proved to be exactly what Bethany needed. The days were busy enough to keep her mind occupied, the work straightforward enough that she quickly mastered it, and Mrs. Blake was a patient teacher. Most importantly, the cafe's cheerful atmosphere and Mrs. Blake's no-nonsense attitude meant that customers treated Bethany with respect. A week after she started, Ryker Sinclair came into the cafe during the mid-morning lull. Bethany was wiping down tables when the bell over the door jingled, and she looked up to see him removing his hat as he entered. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair." Mrs. Blake called from behind the counter. "Coffee, please," he replied, then noticed Bethany. "Miss Jones, I heard you'd found employment here. It suits you." Bethany smiled, surprised at how pleased she was to see him. "Thank you. It suits me far better than idleness did." Ryker sat at a table by the window, and Bethany brought him coffee and a slice of Mrs. Blake's apple pie without being asked. "A man could get used to such thoughtful service," he said with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Emma mentioned you favor the apple pie," Bethany explained. "I'm learning to anticipate our regular customers' preferences." "Am I a regular customer? I believe this is only my second visit this month." "Perhaps you should come more often, then," Bethany suggested, then blushed at her own boldness. Ryker's smile widened. "Perhaps I should." Over the next few weeks, he did just that. Every few days, he would stop by the cafe, sometimes for breakfast, sometimes just for coffee. He always sat at the same table by the window, and they would talk during quiet moments. Bethany learned that Ryker had come to Texas after the war with nothing but determination and a head for business. He'd worked as a cowhand, saved his money, made smart investments in cattle and land, and slowly built his holdings until he could purchase a substantial ranch. Now, at 31, he employed over 20 men and was known for paying fair wages and treating his hands well. "My father was a banker in Boston," Bethany told him during one of their conversations. "He was well respected until the end, when gambling debts consumed everything. I never knew about his vices until after he died." "That must have been a terrible shock," Ryker said sympathetically. "It was. But in some ways, coming here has been liberating. In Boston, I lived according to strict social rules. Here, I'm learning who I am without those constraints." "And who is that?" Ryker asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. Bethany considered the question seriously. "Someone stronger than I knew. Someone who cries when she needs to but gets up and keeps going afterward." He reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "I knew that about you from the first moment we met." As summer progressed, Bethany settled into life in Redemption Creek. She made friends beyond Emma and Mrs. Blake, the young schoolteacher, the blacksmith's wife, the telegraph operator who lent her books. She still cried sometimes when memories of her father or her old life surfaced unexpectedly, but she no longer felt ashamed of her tears. She also saw more of Ryker. He began inviting her to Sunday drives in his buggy, taking her to see the countryside around Redemption Creek. One golden afternoon in late August, he drove her to a spot by the creek that ran through his property, where cottonwood trees provided dappled shade. "This is where all the arguing is about?" Bethany asked, looking at the clear water flowing over smooth stones. "Water is life out here," Ryker explained, helping her down from the buggy. "Without access to it, land is nearly worthless, and cattle can't survive." He spread a blanket under one of the trees, and they sat together, sharing a picnic lunch Mrs. Blake had packed. "The small ranchers are afraid I'll cut them off completely," Ryker continued. "But that's never been my intention. I just need reliable water for my breeding stock." "Why not explain that to them?" "I've tried. But there's history here. Big ranchers have pushed out smaller ones before. They've seen it happen and assume I'm no different." Bethany studied his face, noting the frustration in his expression. "It bothers you that they think poorly of you." "Of course it does," Ryker admitted. "I want to build something here, something lasting. But I don't want to be the villain in the story of Redemption Creek." "Then show them you're not," Bethany said simply. Ryker looked at her with growing wonder. "You make it sound so straightforward." "Perhaps it is. Actions speak louder than words or legal documents." They fell silent, listening to the water flowing and birds singing in the trees. After a while, Ryker spoke again, his voice softer. "You know, when I first saw you that day in town, with tears on your face and those men mocking you, I was angry. Not just at them, but at this whole place that sees softness as something to despise." "It's a hard land," Bethany said. "I understand better now why people here value toughness." "Toughness, yes. Cruelty, no." Ryker shook his head. "There's room for tenderness, even in the hardest places. Maybe especially there." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You've shown me that, Bethany. You've reminded me of the person I want to be." Her heart hammering, Bethany placed her hand over his. "And what kind of person is that?" Someone worthy of a woman whose tears shine like diamonds, he said softly, before leaning in to kiss her. The kiss was gentle at first, then deeper as Bethany responded, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing quickly. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Ryker confessed. "I've wanted you to," Bethany replied with a smile. They spent the afternoon by the creek, talking about their pasts, their hopes, and the future they were beginning to imagine might include each other. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Ryker helped Bethany back into the buggy for the return to town. "I had an idea," he said as they drove, "about showing the ranchers I'm not the enemy." "Tell me," Bethany encouraged. "What if I built a system of irrigation channels? Controlled water flow that would ensure everyone has access, regardless of property boundaries." Bethany considered this. "Wouldn't that be expensive?" "Yes, but I can afford it. And it would benefit my land too, eventually." "It sounds like a wonderful solution," she said warmly. "A way to build community instead of division." When they reached the cafe, Ryker helped her down from the buggy, holding her hands longer than necessary. "I'd like to court you properly, Bethany Jones," he said formally. "With Mrs. Blake's approval, since she seems to have taken on a guardian's role for you." Happiness bubbled up inside her. "I'd like that very much, Ryker Sinclair." The following Sunday, Ryker came to the cafe dressed in his best suit, carrying flowers for both Bethany and Mrs. Blake. He formally asked permission to court Bethany, which Mrs. Blake granted with a knowing smile. "About time you got around to asking," she told him. "You've been sweet on her since the first time you saw her." Word spread quickly through Redemption Creek that Ryker Sinclair was courting the Boston girl who worked at the Willow Tree Cafe. Some people frowned in disapproval, Martha Wilson and Mrs. Cooper chief among them, but many others seemed pleased. "You've made quite an impression on folks," Emma told Bethany as they prepared the cafe for opening one morning. "Not just because of Mr. Sinclair either. People respect how hard you've worked to make a place for yourself here." True to his word, Ryker began the irrigation project, hiring local men for the labor and consulting with the smaller ranchers about their needs. The work created goodwill and gradually changed perceptions about his intentions. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures to Texas, Bethany found herself happier than she'd ever been. She had meaningful work, true friends, and a man who looked at her as if she hung the stars in the sky. On a crisp October evening, Ryker took her to dinner at the hotel dining room, the finest establishment in Redemption Creek. Afterward, they walked under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "I've been thinking," Ryker said, his arm around her waist. "The house at the ranch is too big for just one person." Bethany's heart skipped. "Is it? It needs a woman's touch. Curtains, perhaps. Flowers in the garden." The sound of laughter. He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that I love you, Bethany Jones. I love your kindness, your strength, your tears, and your smiles. I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me." Joy welled up inside her, along with tears that she no longer tried to hide. "I love you too, Ryker. So very much." He brushed away a tear with his thumb, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a diamond ring that caught the starlight and seemed to glow from within. "Will you marry me, Bethany? Will you make a home with me, share my dreams, and let me share yours?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of love. They were married in the small church in Redemption Creek 2 weeks later. Mrs. Blake gave Bethany away, and Emma was her bridesmaid. To Bethany's surprise, nearly the entire town attended, including some of the ranchers who had once been Ryker's most vocal critics. "Your irrigation project changed minds," Emma explained at the reception. "And your happiness is hard to resent. You two look at each other like you're the only people in the world." Life at the ranch was an adjustment. Bethany had never managed a household of that size before, but she took to it with determination and grace. She started a garden, redecorated rooms that had been purely functional into warm, inviting spaces, and learned to ride so she could accompany Ryker around the property. She also started a small school for the children of the ranch hands, teaching 3 days a week in a room Ryker had built onto the bunkhouse. She found her training as a teacher hadn't been wasted after all, just redirected to a different kind of classroom. As winter settled over Texas, bringing cool rains and occasional frosts, Bethany and Ryker sat before the fire in their home, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against him. "Do you ever miss Boston?" he asked, stroking her hair. Bethany considered the question. "I miss certain things, the libraries, the concerts, some of my students. But no, I don't miss the life I had there. This is where I belong now. Even with all the hardships, the drought last month, the wolf that took 2 calves, the leak in the roof during that storm." She laughed softly. "Even with all of that, those are just problems to solve together, not reasons to regret my choices." Ryker kissed her temple. "You know, when I first saw you crying in the street that day, I never imagined you'd become the strongest person I know." "I'm not sure I'm that," Bethany demurred. "You are," he insisted. "Strength isn't about never breaking down or never showing emotion. It's about continuing on despite the breaks and the feelings. It's about facing each day with hope instead of fear. Then we're both strong," she said, turning to kiss him properly. "And together, we're stronger still." In the spring, when wildflowers carpeted the Texas hills in explosions of color, Bethany told Ryker she was expecting their first child. He whooped with joy, picking her up and spinning her around before setting her down gently, suddenly concerned he might have jostled her. "I'm not made of glass," she laughed, her hands resting on her still flat stomach. "The baby and I are both healthy and strong. Like diamonds," Ryker said, his eyes shining with love. "Beautiful and unbreakable." Their daughter was born the following winter, a healthy girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's gentle spirit. They named her Hope, for what had sustained them both through difficult times. As Bethany rocked her daughter to sleep in the nursery Ryker had built with his own hands, she sometimes thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment, the grief that had forced her to leave Boston, the tears that had marked her arrival in Redemption Creek, the strength she had found within herself, and the love that had transformed her life. She no longer hid her tears, whether of joy or sorrow. She let them fall freely, shining like the diamonds Ryker had once compared them to, precious, valuable, and completely her own.